You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada, because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade.
Today on From Embers, we're going to be talking about the unfolding crisis in Venezuela, and specifically the role that the Canadian state is playing in all of this. To be honest, I was not entirely sure about how to approach this topic. If you get your information about what's happening from mainstream English language sources, the story that's told is one where all the protagonists are politicians. So on the one hand, there's an ostensibly socialist government, led by Nicolás Maduro, and accused of widespread corruption and mismanagement. And on the other, a self-declared president named Juan Guaidó, backed domestically by business elites, and supported abroad by a coalition of right-wing Latin American governments and their Western allies, especially the United States and Canada. See, the thing is, the politics of anti-imperialism can be tricky for us anarchists to navigate. We are, after all, against all states, including ostensibly socialist ones, that make enemies with the US empire. So, despite what some authoritarians might have us believe, the enemy of your enemy is not necessarily your friend. Take, for example, the war in Syria, where some so-called anti-imperialists continue to defend ruthless dictators like Bashar al-Assad, a man who massacres his own people in the name of socialism. Of course, Venezuela is not Syria and Maduro is not Assad, but you get my point. So when I saw that some anti-authoritarians in North America were mobilizing against the intervention in Venezuela, issuing statements, disrupting government press conferences and such, it piqued my interest. When I dug a little deeper, I learned that they were not acting in the name of Nicolás Maduro, but in defense of the Bolivarian Revolution, a political process initiated by former President Hugo Chavez, but with a popular base of support that aims to redistribute land and wealth and implement structures of direct democracy and worker self-management through the proliferation of communes. So far, these goals haven't been realized outside of certain pockets, and the process has been on shaky ground since Chavez's death in 2013, as well as the recent decline in oil prices that have hammered the national economy. And of course, I should say that there are passionate debates among anarchists about whether direct democracy and worker self-management is even a good thing. When I tried to research what anarchists in Venezuela were saying, some are involved with trying to push the revolution further from inside the communes, while others reject the Bolivarian process outright for its undeniable association with the Venezuelan state. But the anarchists and anti-authoritarians that I spoke to and read about who are sympathetic to the Bolivarian Revolution are doing so in the name of popular power and the potential for this process to transcend or dissolve the Venezuelan state and spread beyond its borders. So while the show is primarily about Canada's interest in Venezuela, I will include some links to English language articles in the show notes if you want to learn more. I think this is a challenging and interesting topic that I think is worth learning more about. Tonight's feature interview is with Lydia of the Women's Coordinating Committee for Free Wallmapu, a grassroots organization based in Toronto with ties to the Mapuche struggle in Chile. I asked her about Canada's role in the intervention and recent action she's taken to disrupt mainstream narratives about so-called democracy in Venezuela.
Hi, my name is, I'll go by Lydia for this podcast, and I'm with the Women's Coordinating Committee for a Free Wallmapu, which is a Mapuche organization, indigenous organization that's based in Toronto, and I'm really happy to be able to join the show.
Great. And could you give a bit of a background to the coordinating committee, a bit of the history of the group, what it focuses on, what its politics are, that kind of stuff?
Right. Well, the Women's Coordinating Committee for Free Wallmapu has been around for quite some time now. We've been working on indigenous sovereignty issues in so-called southern Chile for the last 15 years, if not more, and have really tried to connect the issues of indigenous sovereignty rights as well as anti-colonial and anti-capitalist struggles all throughout the continent as well. So our major work has been trying to translate the original works of Mapuche political prisoners that are currently in prison in Chile for fighting for their land rights, as well as trying to connect the issues of anti-colonialism and anti-capitalism here on Turtle Island. That includes being in solidarity with frontline warriors who are resisting extractivism and other international projects and national projects here in so-called Canada as well. So we've been kind of trying to unite these different struggles, and that also means looking at anti-capitalist struggles in Latin America as well. So.
Great. And I know this is a big question, and it'll probably be a couple weeks before this comes out. So obviously the situation in Venezuela is changing day to day. But would you be able to give just a basic overview of what you understand is kind of happening right now?
Okay, so basically the situation in Venezuela is extremely volatile. Recently, just about a couple of months ago now, the situation has gotten tense because there has been obviously an ongoing economic crisis that has fueled the country for the past few years, but has reached a boiling point in the last few months. That has been coming about, in our perspective, it's been coming about because of the political opposition in terms of the capital strikes that are happening on the ground, which have enabled inflation and a whole bunch of other things going through the roof, as well as an over-reliance on certain industries, which we can talk a little bit more about later. But the point is that the opposition has really taken that to heart and being able to take this opportunity to be able to mobilize against the Maduro government, which, as you know, it's a socialist government that's in place right now, or at least is in a socialist process that is trying to develop throughout the last 20 years through Chavez and now through Maduro. The crisis has, as I mentioned before, come to a boiling point where the opposition is taking any chance it can get to be able to regain its power as the oligarchy of Venezuela. If we look at the history of Venezuela, there's always been this very rich, very select group of mostly white oligarchs that have always taken place and that have always ruled Venezuela over the last I would say over almost 100 years, especially since the discovery of oil within the country. But now it's gotten to the boiling point. But basically, in the last couple of months, Juan Guaido, who is the leader of the National Assembly, basically it became the self-proclaimed leader of the country and trying to use the Venezuelan constitution, so-called trying to use the Venezuelan constitution as a way of being able to legitimize his power within the country, even though the only way in which the Venezuelan people can actually come about with a new president is actually through the Supreme Court or through complete different elections altogether. And so earlier this year, we saw that the re-election did take place, but the opposition actually boycotted that effort. And so but yet at the same time, there's the leader of the National Assembly trying to self-proclaim themselves as the president of the country. And at the same time, after this, there is a whole bunch of international recognition through to Guaido that started with the United States, then through the rest of Latin America, and then obviously through Canada as well, because Canada hasn't been immune to this. So this has created a political crisis that has tried to take Maduro out of office, and in the way in which, because of the foreign influence that has really pressured down on the Venezuelan people, it's very obviously a very manipulative coup from beyond the country, because the people who recognize Guaido as a legitimate leader are not actually the folks that are in Venezuela proper. There's a whole bunch of issues that are going on there between opposition and pro-Chavista forces in Venezuela proper as well. And so that has come about with a whole bunch of push from the international community to try and take out Maduro from office and try and recognize Guaido as the main president of Venezuela. One of the forefront countries that have been pushing for this more than ever has been Canada at the forefront. We have Foreign Affairs Minister Chrysler Freeland, who has been spearheading the Lima Group talks in the last few months, in fact. And the Lima Group itself is basically a conjunction of various Latin American conservative governments, which includes Canada, in trying to be able to put pressure on the Venezuelan government to try and get Maduro and his party out of range. So it's been quite a tumultuous turn in the last few weeks.
Yes, and I noticed when Guaido declared himself president, it took Canada about 3 hours to issue a statement recognizing him as president of Venezuela. So clearly it was a coordinated effort and a planned thing. And I think many people would be surprised to sort of learn about Canada's involvement in the Lima Group. Often it's described as a coalition of conservative Latin American governments. Why do you think Canada is so involved in the Lima Group, and what is the Lima Group, and what is its purpose?
Well, the Lima Group actually formed at the end of 2017 as a way of being able to put more political pressure on the Maduro government to try and oust the Bolivarian process out of power in Venezuela. And so they slowly came together. Ironically, the first meeting that they had, I believe, was spearheaded by Canada, by Minister Freeland, I believe in August of 2017. And the reasons why Canada would want to be able to spearhead this, both in terms of trying to, there's two things. One is Canada's role as trying to keep up a third wave face in the same way that the Harper government tried to push years ago in trying to both spearhead neoliberal reform throughout Latin America, but at the same time kind of being the so-called friendly face of neoliberalism, not the hard end stick like the United States has traditionally portrayed itself within the continent, but as a way of being able to quote unquote open doors within the region, right? And so this hypocrisy manifests itself through the Lima Group. And so there's also, at the same time, there's also a whole bunch of economic and political reasons why Canada would want to be able to spearhead the Lima Group, including further investment in mining and further investment in also oil as well. But the extractivist industry in Canada is quite large. We are the largest export of mining companies throughout the world. In fact, in Latin America is a major focus for Canadian foreign policy. And so right now, because of the Venezuelan Bolivarian process, despite many of the internal contradictions that there may be, it's a lot harder for Canadian industry to be able to penetrate the market there in the same way that they would if there was a neoliberal friendly face in power in Venezuela. And so because Canada has a huge economic interest in being able to create more extractivist industries in the region, that's probably one of the main reasons why Canada is also at the spearhead of this whole battle. So it's not really surprising to see Canada be a big global actor when it comes to international interference in Venezuela.
You mentioned the Bolivarian revolutionary process in Venezuela. Can you give our listeners a bit of a background on what that is and what you find inspiring about it?
So the Bolivarian process has been ongoing since 1999, officially since Chavez was elected president in Venezuela, and has been a slow process of socialization of services, of natural resources, of other things to try and take away the power from global elites towards the development of the nation in that sense. Now, there's several points in which the Bolivarian process has developed, both in which it follows the model that Salvador Allende in Chile had proposed many years prior, 30 years prior to when Chavez was elected, in that the democratic road to socialism. So that also means a bottom-up process where you not only have like the political parties that are trying to organize the masses in different ways, but you also have grassroots participation of the taking over of different workplaces, of trying to be able to socialize various services, including even in terms of distribution, the nationalization of certain industries, and we saw the nationalization of the oil industry, at least with the one major company in Venezuela, the major state company in the late 2000s, and so this has been a steady growth of the socialization of the Venezuelan peoples throughout the last 20 years. So one of the things that at least is inspiring, at least to me, despite some of the criticisms that I've had of it in the past, is the fact that there is a lot of grassroots mobilizing, and the fact that there's these organizations that are trying to take on different aspects of the economy, both in terms of organizing production as well as organizing defense militias to be able to respond onto different kinds of attacks, both on the part of the opposition, which, as has been said, is actually mostly centered on upper middle class and elite interests in the country. And so we have a process that has tried to basically take over certain sectors of the industries to try and socialize them. Now, there are limitations, of course, to this model in regards to the fact that it's a slow process. It's not a thing that's done overnight like a normal revolution would. It also means a lot of concessions along the way that it's the kind of push push and pull that you would have to deal with the governing elites. It also opens up a lot of other questions in regards to like governmentality and the way in which the new government that is in place doesn't take over like the same like norms or forms of repression that the previous elites did. So it's this constant struggle of trying to push towards a broader socialization, and the process is definitely not perfect, but it is encouraging to at least see that the mobilizing is happening and that there is the organization that's happening on the ground. And that's something that at least for us that I think is a big inspiration. That and the fact that as Mapuche people and indigenous peoples of Latin America, we've already seen the kind of plunder that neoliberal economics have imposed on our lands and territories. And it is actually inspiring to see people actually organize against these kinds of things on a broader scale, and that these people have also supported at least morally, our own struggles, like within our own territories as well. So there is this kind of mutual solidarity of sorts, because the process has always been quite open and supportive of our own demands on our own territories, within Wallmapu, for example, unto the repression of the Chilean state.
Yeah, and in preparing for this interview, I did a bit of reading. I'm not super well versed in the history of Venezuela, but some authors were arguing that the relationship between the social movements in Venezuela and the state is complicated in the sense that there is this tension between centralization and decentralization when it comes to sort of workers' control or peasant control of the economy. Do you have any comment about that in terms of what role the state plays in this whole process?
I mean, this is the big question that all revolutionary processes have to deal with, right? We see this not just in Venezuela, but we also saw this in Chile as well. So one of the things, at least one of the main reasons why I am, and our group in particular, is very supportive of this, of at least the Bolivarian process and the way in which this has been carried out, and the fact that this is, according to us, international aggression, is that we've seen the same kind of play-by-play interventions that have happened like on our own territories, right? So with Allende, the same things happened during the United Popular Government between 1970 and 1973, where there were the grassroots mobilizing and workers mobilizing to be able to take over their own workplaces. And there was always tension with the broader centralization of the state and being able, and at one point, the movement actually surpassed a lot of the state in terms of its own organizing. So this is, again, like I mentioned earlier, it has to do with the idea that because this process is not an overnight revolution, because it's a slow process of push and pull, there's always these tensions that come about, and one of them, of course, is what you mentioned, the notion of the centralization and whatnot within the country itself. I think that the thing that people have to remember is that the process itself isn't about one person. It is not necessarily just about one structure. It is the people themselves. They're the ones that are pushing through the model itself. As in Chile, and what we're seeing right now in Venezuela as well, is that even with economic sanctions, even with capital boycotts, even with a whole bunch of other restrictions within the population, people continue to mobilize towards the organization of socialist goals. And that is that's huge. And so while there is a tension, push and pull between the government centrality and worker owner control, eventually those things are going to have to come to heed with each other. And the moment that I believe that the state tries to co-opt completely these different movements is when they're they're going to collapse. We saw in Chile how Salvador Allende tried to impose certain forms of centralization, and how those didn't work, and how essentially that actually helped weaken the movement that was on the base. And so if the Venezuelan government tries to impose the same things, like, I don't see that necessarily happening I don't see that I don't think that will be something that will benefit them in the long run. So again, the government also has to push and pull with these organizations as well, because there's territorial militias that are now organized from the bottom up. There's now distribution organizations that are organized to be able to make sure that these different the different populations actually have medicine and other kinds of necessities to be able to survive. And those mechanisms are not necessarily controlled from top down. They're bottom up, and it has to be an intricate process, because otherwise they're going to lose support and they're not going to be able to get to where they need to go. So hopefully the movement itself can push them further towards the complete socialization of society. But how that'll happen remains to be seen. And I think it's up to the Venezuelan people to be able to decide how that happens.
A lot of the propaganda that's being put out through the Western media is one about shortages and poverty in Venezuela, and they blame it on government mismanagement. And then they use this image of foreign aid as they almost weaponize this idea of foreign aid and have used it as a way to try to topple the government. Can you talk a bit about sort of what has caused these hardships in Venezuela economically, and also how is Canada and the United States and other Western powers using foreign aid as a weapon?
Right. So what's happening right now in terms of the lack of different goods and goods in Venezuela in particular has to do specifically with the idea of a capital strike. This isn't something that, because of economic mismanagement, that somehow magically that because socialism doesn't work, that the economy has gone to ruins and therefore everyone is poor and miserable. That there are certain companies and industries that have boycotted specifically the production process in order to make certain goods and make certain goods available in the market to be able to give them to the population. And capital strikes are actually a very strategic move on behalf of the governing capitalist elite. They use this all the time. It's actually not a process that is unique to Venezuela. We saw the same thing happen, as I've been comparing a lot, Venezuela to Chile and Allende in the Allende years, but the exact same thing happened, where there are shortages of specific brand name goods. So things that, for example, brand name ketchup, or brand name like the things that you would find in the freezer, like ready-made meals. Those are the things that are actually stopping in production. Or, for example, there are specific finished products that are not available depending on the industry and their take on the Venezuelan process. For example, there are ingredients of various products available, but the finished made product of that may not be available. So, for example, there's access to cheese and other kinds of forms of dairy, but there's a lack of milk, and it depends again on the industry that there is a lack of certain products. So the industry itself boycotts the production process in order to sabotage the government of Venezuela. And the same thing happened, you see the same thing happening with Salvador Allende. One of the things that actually a personal memory, a family history memory of this was the fact that both my parents are from Chile and went through the Allende process. And the day that the coup d'etat came in on September 11th, 1973, there were shortages everywhere. But overnight, they stacked up all of the shelves overnight with all of the goods that had been boycotted throughout months and months of economic disruption. And so it's like these companies, they boycott the process in order to be able to shift the political regime towards their favor. And we actually have seen this not just in Latin America, but there's also been cases of it even in Canada, where, for example, the Bob Rae government, which is a very social democratic government of the early 90s in Ontario, where the governing Chamber of Commerce of Ontario started boycotting the Rae government because of the minor guarantees to social services that he enacted in the early 90s. And this is someone who is not a socialist, is not someone who is pushing for further reform, but they still did a partial economic and capital boycott of Ontario and tried to disincentivize investment in Ontario during that time. So if something like that can happen in Ontario, where again, these people they're liberals, then imagine a process that tries to at least, at the very least, try and rearrange certain forms of distribution, more equitable forms of distribution in society. The kind of economic and boycott that enables is huge. And so right now that right now the economic boycott is targeting, and it's really difficult to get medication because a lot of medication isn't made locally, it's made internationally, and so the medication is very difficult to get. Other forms of medical supplies are also very difficult to get, as well as other made goods that are not produced locally in Venezuela. Otherwise, in terms of fresh food and fruit and produce, you can get that through the direct distribution organizations that supply the population directly from both the farms and the industries. Again, another tactic that was used during the Allende government, as well as other forms of for example, toothpaste and other things that are also readily available. But the people that suffer the most are people that, need access to those medical services. So these economic sanctions that are being put on Venezuela to be able to bring that stuff from abroad is also being hampered, which is another part of the capital boycott that's happening right now.
La semilla empaquetada no nos da seguridad, lo natural ya no se encuentra en esta sociedad. Nacimos engañados, crecimos engañados, pero lo que no saben es que hemos despertado. Su basura y química se ha masificado, la culpa no es de uno, todo estaba creado. La canción no es solución, solo es la herramienta, la letra y el contenido es lo que respecta. Esperamos que oigan y lo comprendan, porque hay un gentío rebelde cansado de esta mierda. El capitalismo no siente lástima por el pueblo, nos tratan como animales, como burros y camellos. Nos venden y nos sumisan por medio de un cajón. Nos dicen que está bien aunque cambie de color. Cuidado con el fruto del país de maravilla, porque nos convencen tanto hasta que lo consumen.
Nací pobre, a mí no me preguntaron si quería vivir o si lo que quería era ser esclavo sin chance. Retrocedí, me cobraron y cuando abrí los ojos ya todo estaba diseñado. Nací pobre, a mí no me preguntaron si quería vivir o si lo que quería era ser esclavo sin chance. Retrocedí, me cobraron y cuando abrí los ojos ya todo estaba diseñado.
La cadena tan atada, arrastrada de condena. Nosotros somos la consecuencia de lo que llamas problema. Estamos diseñados para construir capital. Ahora la fuerza colectiva la que lo va a derrumbar. Porque yo nací pobre y ya estaba endeudado bajo el sistema capital, donde su objetivo es crear esclavos. Porque nací me cobraron, cuando viví me cobraron, y cuando de seguro muera el dinero no me ha alcanzado. Todo esto deja claro que andamos en guerra de clase. Lo de arriba la élite y el pueblo la base. Ellos quieren manipularnos, rendirnos como mano de obra, pero nos pensamos que a diario el tiempo nos roba. Pero ya despertamos y el enemigo no se le da tregua. Ellos jaman la flojera, eso se nota legua. Entonces dime tú, ¿Cómo quieres que confíe? Ver a la pura esclavizada del patrón frente a mí se ríe.
Nací pobre, a mí no me preguntaron si quería vivir o si lo que quería era ser esclavo sin chance. Retroceder, me cobraron para nacer. Y cuando abrí los ojos ya todo estaba diseñado. Nací pobre, a mí no me preguntaron si quería vivir o si lo que quería era ser esclavo sin chance. Retroceder, me cobraron para nacer. Y cuando abrí los ojos ya todo estaba diseñado.
Porque los planes, conceptos, costumbres, formas de vivir nunca ha sido pensado por el pueblo proletario. Porque de tantas mentiras terminamos creyendo que somos los flojos y ellos los estupendos. Dime quién se cala. Madre cola en autobús con dirección a la fábrica para que enriquezcas tú. Dime quién se cala. Madre cola en autobús con dirección a la fábrica para que enriquezcas tú. Es que ya antes de nacer ya éramos subesclavos, esclavistas, esclavizados de un sistema explotador, ignorante de verdades, lleno de dificultades, consumista, mala gente, rencoroso, coño de madre, consecuencia de un sistema que nos convierte en ociosos.
Que nos convierte en ociosos. No somos culpables de nada. Clase original, hijos del 89. Revolución, no perdamos el tiempo. Condenando consecuencias. Somos la solución.
You're listening to From Embers, either on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, or maybe the podcast version, where you can find us on any podcatching app by searching for From Embers. We're also a part of the Channel Zero Anarchist podcast network. Tonight, our show is about the crisis in Venezuela and Canada's role in it. We're about halfway through now, and our guest is Lydia from the Women's Coordinating Committee for Free Wallmapu. How central to the Venezuelan economy is the oil industry and oil extraction, and what role has that played in this whole situation?
It's a big chunk of the of the economy. It's actually one of the biggest problems, at least in regards to like our point of view, in the sense that because they've relied so heavily on the oil industry, and during the Chavez years in particular, there was a heavy and extreme reliance on the oil industry sector to be able to push forward these different distributive, like economic distributive programs to be able to get the lower income population like a bit more distributive justice. And so it's a big problem. And now because not only oil has tanked, which is also part of the reason why there's some economic there is economic insecurity in Venezuela, but also because of the various sanctions that are being put in by international governments and onto different like modes of economic production in terms of oil. It plays a huge part, and it's actually like one of the biggest criticisms from the left that people have made onto the process, in that there needs to be some kind of diversification of the economy to be able to have the process be able to survive, because without a diversification, then you can't actually be able to attain the goals. On top of the fact that the oil industry itself is problematic and needs to hone down a whole bunch because of economic and also issues of climate and whatnot as well. It's a huge problem, but they do heavily rely on the oil industry. It's something that they need to. The only thing is that as someone who isn't from Venezuela, they have to figure that out themselves, and being able to try and diversify their own economies. And I think hopefully maybe this is going to give them a bit more of a push in that direction. But we'll see. That's something that they have to decide.
Going back to the Lima Group, so there was a meeting in Ottawa on February 4th, and there was protests in several cities across Canada, and you were involved in a disruption of the closing press conference of that. Can you tell us sort of the story of what happened there?
As the Women's Coordinating Committee, we've always been very committed to the idea of, as Indigenous women, that we've seen the interventions of these people in our own territories for a very long time, and the fact that that Canada is leading the way in what seems to be like Salvador Allende 2.0 in terms of being able to topple a socialist-minded government. And so we decided as Indigenous women to try and make a stand. And in particular, the lead up to the Lima Group conference in Ottawa was particularly gruesome in the sense that there was a whole bunch of censorship towards leftist and also alternative media within not just the continent, but also internationally. So we see that Telesur was banned from the press conference as well, and from the meeting in general, as well as other international media sources like RT, Sputnik, and a whole bunch of others were censored from the press conference. They didn't give them the passes to go through. And at the same time, online, there's a social media block on talking about anything regarding some alternative sources from the continent. So, for example, Cuban sources were censored online. We couldn't post anything that had to do with Venezuela from a variety of different websites from Cuba, even the more critical ones like the Havana Free Times. You couldn't post anything on Facebook. It wouldn't let you. It would mark it as spam in the lead up to the press conference. And so we, because of this ongoing kind of censorship, as well as the fact that there hasn't been really a two-sided debate, even in the media, in regards to this issue, we decided to go and do something about it. And both another member from the organization and I are actually journalists who write for various sources and have written for various sources for quite some time now. In particular, I've been writing for a small alternative newspaper called The Leveler, which is a Carleton University-based alternative newspaper in Ottawa, which is also heavily leaning towards the left. In fact, has posted a whole bunch of issues on police brutality and other sorts of housing injustices here in Ottawa. And so we decided to come in as a journalist that we are, and use the press passes to be able to go in, and if we manage to get accepted as journalists, be able to do a banner drop. And so we were not expecting to get in. We thought that The Leveler was also going to be censored as the leftist alternative media source that it is. But it wasn't, and so we did manage to go in, and with that, we took our banner, and we had a couple of flyers, and so when they came up to speak, we took the time to be able to drop the banner in front of everyone. Which was surreal and nerve-wracking and amazing. And so, and then they escorted us out. Quite intensely at points, because they were very angry and about how did we manage to get in, but because we did have our proper accreditation from the newspaper that we had, it was completely fine. They couldn't do anything about it, so they just escorted us out, and we had to take a cab downtown, and that was the end of it. But it was it was a nerve-wracking experience. It kind of I think it really shows how the state is so integrated with the media in this country that they didn't even bother to double check or even check us while we were going in. And I think it speaks volumes to the kind of press that we have here in this country, that we say that it's impartial and objective, but in reality, it's just a PR machine for the governing elites. So it was super surreal to be able to do something like that and make a big stand for something that we believe in so deeply. So we all know that they, regardless of your opinion about the Maduro government and the Venezuelan process itself, we all, and I'm sure the listeners know that the only reason that they wanted that these people want to topple the government is to be able to plunder the resources that they have, regardless of whether or not you believe in the government or not. We know that this has been their history for the past, since their inception. It's happened on our territories. It's happened on indigenous territories here. It's only just a maneuver to be able to gain further resources and further their profits. So.
Yeah, I'd love to link to the video of the banner drop as well, because you can just, I watched it and I found it very suspenseful.
Yeah.
You can feel how scary it would be to just jump up in front of a room of people like that.
It was terrifying, but it was at the same time really gratifying, because there's like, you note that also, just to say this and not to blow smoke up ourselves or whatnot, but this is the second time that we've done this with this, not with the Lima Group, but with this similar like spheres of people, because there was an interruption that we also held at the Monk School in Toronto, where Minister Freeland was there, and as well as I believe it was an ex-member of the Venezuelan government who flipped over to the other side and was trying to organize people to try and have massive international intervention. I think she was the ex Attorney General who was there, and we did the banner drop in front of the entire Isabel Bader Theater with 500 people in the room, and we were there with the same banner, and we did that the year before, so we kept that banner. And we did the same thing here, but it was absolutely nerve-wracking. I'm just glad that, things turned out as well as it did. I was very surprised, actually, that they didn't just censor us, like, in the room. But it did reach international, like, headlines. Like, we came up in, like, CNN International in Chile and other places in Latin America. It was kind of ridiculous. So, but ever since then, the good thing has been that there has been more outspoken dissent to the official language of the current Canadian government in regards to the issue. There has been a variety of different viewpoints that have kind of sprung from this meeting and questioning the legitimacy of the Guaido initiative of trying to take over. There's also been a whole bunch of different hoaxes that have been uncovered. So it's been good in that way, and being able to say that we did what we needed to do to try and say that not everyone here on this territory agrees or is reflected with the policies of the current government, and especially when it comes to international intervention.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I think our listeners are mostly in the anarchist and anti-authoritarian kind of world in so-called North America. I'm wondering, what would you like to see people do to express their solidarity with, if not the government of Venezuela, because people are critical of that, but with the people of Venezuela? What kinds of things would you like to see start happening to try to challenge this sort of Western back intervention in Latin America?
I think that the importance of being able to vocalize international solidarity for not just for people in Venezuela, but like for the regional issues that are happening. A lot of the times, North America tends to be very centered in terms of local struggles or European struggles, and our continent is kind of like lost in the translation. And being able to engage a little bit more in terms of going out on the streets and having your own opinions about the things, and actually supporting the actions that are happening, because there's lots of things that are happening in different cities, and it's okay to have different points of views, and as long as you understand that there's an intersection of different things that are happening, right? It's not just about the question of the state, but it's also the movement itself that's behind it, that has its own purposes and its own validity and its own ways of organizing that are also valid, and being able to recognize that, and also questioning the Canadian government's policies and challenging them, and being able to call them out if they have a chance of calling them out. If these people are going to go speak at certain places, to be able to call them out. One of the most frustrating things, I think, even from like the folks that are more into the more pro like Maduro line, is the fact that, we did this action, but it's like, okay, and what are the other things that people can do? It's not just about the marches. It's also about like the interruptions and the fact that people can actually vocalize their dissent to, the colonial government that is Canada, and the fact that they're trying to impose their ways, whatever they are, on different, nations and other like movements around the world. And it's completely justified to do that, even if you don't necessarily agree with everything that, certain states or governments are doing per se. It's important to show that, that anti-colonialism and also anti-imperialism in a grassroots sense is also valid. It's a valid form of resistance. So,
and I'm just wondering, what do you think is next for the Women's Coordinating Committee? And I would love to have you back, by the way, to talk about the Mapuche struggle another time. But yeah, what's coming up for you?
For us, we're trying to translate and organize on the basis of supporting our Mapuche political prisoners, as always, trying to connect the issues of Indigenous sovereignty with our peoples. There's been, actually, ironically, because the other reason why we're also very supportive of this issue is about how hypocritical the Chilean government has been in regards to the so-called human rights violations in Venezuela. Meanwhile, our people are completely militarized in the south, where our territories are. And right now, there's huge militarization that's happening with our own peoples. And so what we're going to try and do is try and spread the word on the various actions that our people are doing in support of their own self-determination, of their own sovereignty against neoliberal capital within our territories, and try and be able to hopefully one of these days have a speaker come from our territories to come and give their own perspective, but that's more long-term. And also trying to just be a voice for the various social movements in our territories that get silenced, even here even in radical circles in North America. So hopefully trying to broaden that out, and have different speaker series and film series to try and open that debate is something that we're going to be looking at in the future, as per always. So yeah, we'll see you guys in both in workshops and events, but also on the streets too.
That concludes our show tonight of From Embers on CFRC 101.9 FM, or maybe the podcast version online, where you can search for From Embers and you'll find us there. We're a regular anarchist and anti-authoritarian news and views show based out of Kingston, Ontario. If you want to give us some feedback, which we welcome, you send us an email at fromembers@riseup.net. And that was Lydia from the Women's Coordinating Committee for Free Wallmapu. You can find them on Facebook at Women's Coordinating Committee for Free Wallmapu, or their WordPress at wcctoronto.wordpress.com.
Asumiendo la batalla batalla, la lucha y la comprensión. Caminamos en senderos hechos en revolución, abordando comunidades, tratando de rescatar a ese chamo, a ese pelao que piensa solo en matar. No llevamos 2 meses, llevamos casi 3 años haciendo rap con buen contenido y revolucionario. Somos las voces de los que no quieren ser mandados. Alza el puño si de esto estás cansado.
Hoy el grito se mantiene mientras que el tiempo trasciende. La discusión de ideas de una juventud rebelde, sin ser más amoldeable, pero con la convicción de seguir en esta lucha, nacidos en revolución. Se discuten propuestas mientras que ideas emanan. El presente nos obliga a pensar en el mañana, donde no existirán estructuras ni corrupción, porque no habrá ni obreros ni patrón.
Somos revolucionarios desde que nacimos, hasta nuestros parientes fueron asesinados por aquellos que los querían mandar, pero ellos se alzaron y empezaron a luchar igual a nosotros, como le estamos haciendo ahorita, ayudando a mi pueblo que es el que necesita. Y aquí estamos desde el 2010 en causa de resistencia, en causa de resistencia.
Asumimos la chamba y en ella nos mantenemos, produciendo ideas en base a lo que desconocemos. Entendemos que lo impuesto solo trae violencia, por eso nos mantenemos en resistencia. Asumimos la chamba y en ella nos mantenemos, produciendo ideas en base a lo que desconocemos. Entendemos que lo impuesto solo trae violencia, por eso nos mantenemos en resistencia.
Hay que pensar en ayudar a nuestra gente y pienso que no es difícil si la lucha es persistente. La chamba se asumió y nos mantenemos de pie. Juventud revolucionaria, habla claro que es lo que somos, que el fruto de la rabia, la rebeldía y el dolor. El futuro de esta patria depende de nuestra acción, caminando en colectivo, apostando a la unión y para que se consolide la revolución. Dejando el egoísmo a pesar de nuestras edades, la juventud se reveló cansada de sus necesidades. El trabajo como este sin aparentar pantalla, viendo nuestro alrededor como el sistema estalla. Somos como Ali Primera, Bolivia y el Che Guevara, y como los ancestros cuidando la Pachamama, hablándole verdades a nuestra sociedad. Nosotros con llave en la clase original,
rebeldes con causa y conciencia de clase, asumiendo la balanza, tributando a la base. Pase lo que pase, seguiremos en el sendero, evolucionando adelante. Eso es lo primero, haciendo las cosas como se tienen que hacer. Seguiremos hacia adelante, no nos van a detener. Esta es la purita de Zapata y Pancho Villa, y de este fruto seguiremos expandiendo semillas.
Entender un trabajo que muchos subestiman, comunicar y bajar al rapero de la tarima, pensarnos como clase, la fiel original, destrozar todo capitán que nos quiere esclavizar. Somos voz de un pueblo que se encuentra oprimido, que en tantos años un capital lo tiene dormido, con rabia y con dolor. Esto así se escribe, por siempre me mantendré en la lucha con lo que vive.
Asumimos la chamba y en ella nos mantenemos, produciendo ideas en base a lo que desconocemos. Entendemos que...
Where did you get this?
Your friendly neighborhood anarchist.
More of an anarchist militant.
People involved in social struggles than everybody else.
People have been waiting for some content.
Radio and show.
The Final Straw and I'm William Goodenough.
From Embers to Goodness.
The Final Straw Radio.noblogs.org.
If you're listening, you are the resistance.